It was October 3rd, 2018, just outside Greene County, Iowa, the kind of morning where the fog sat low over the fields, and the air smelled faintly of rust and wet soil. A line of trucks rolled slowly down a gravel road no one had used in years, their tires crunching over stones that hadn't been disturbed since the last harvest season. At the end of that road stood a leaning wooden shed gray with age, its roof patched in places with mismatched tin sheets. Elias Turner was already there when they arrived. He stood still, hands buried deep in the pockets of a faded brown coat, his posture slightly bent, but steady, as if he had been waiting for this exact moment longer than anyone could guess. The officials stepped out first, two men in pressed jackets followed by a lawyer carrying a clipboard thick with papers. Behind them, a few locals gathered, drawn by rumor more than curiosity. No one spoke at first. Then one of the officials cleared his throat and looked up at the shed. "This is it?" he asked. The lawyer nodded. "According to the records, everything's inside." There was a pause, a long one, because even before they opened the door, people already knew what was in there. 15 years' worth of seized irrigation pumps. Machines taken from bankrupt farms, repossessed by a company that once dominated half the county. Machines that had been dumped one after another into the care of a man most people had stopped noticing years ago. And now that company was gone. Collapsed overnight, they said. What nobody could explain, what no one in that crowd understood, was why Elias Turner had agreed to keep them in the first place, or why he never let a single one go. The doors creaked open slowly, revealing rows upon rows of metal dust-covered silent forgotten. But Elias didn't look surprised. He just nodded once, as if everything had gone exactly the way he knew it would. But to understand why that moment mattered, you have to go back to the day it all began. Back to the summer of 2003. Back to the day Elias Turner became the town's quiet joke. It was late July, the heat pressing down hard on the county fairgrounds where farmers gathered. Not just to show crops and livestock, but to talk business trade parts and keep up with whatever new technology was promising to change their lives that year. That was the summer Hale Irrigation unveiled their newest line of high-efficiency pumps. Martin Hale stood on a temporary wooden stage, sleeves rolled up, voice loud and confident, as he addressed the crowd. He had built his company from almost nothing, or at least that's how he liked to tell it. And now his machines were everywhere, from the smallest farms to the biggest operations across the state. These, he said, patting the polished steel casing of a pump beside him, are the future. More power, less maintenance, smarter systems. You won't find better, not anywhere. People nodded. Some clapped. Others just watched. Elias Turner stood near the back off to the side, his hat pulled low. His expression unreadable. He didn't clap. He didn't move. And Martin Hale noticed. After the demonstration, Hale stepped down and made his way through the crowd, shaking hands, accepting compliments, answering questions. When he reached Elias, he slowed just enough to make it obvious. "Well," Hale said, smiling in a way that didn't quite reach his eyes. "You've been awfully quiet, Elias." A few people nearby turned to listen. Elias lifted his head slightly. "They run smooth," he said. It wasn't praise. It wasn't criticism, just an observation. Hale let out a short laugh. "That's it. That's all you've got." Elias shrugged. And that's when Hale decided to push. "You still using those old scrap pumps out on your place?" he asked, loud enough for others to hear. "Stuff from the 70s, 80s. A few chuckles rippled through the group. Elias didn't answer. Haley leaned in slightly, lowering his voice just enough to sound conversational, but still loud enough to carry. "You know," he said, "there's a reason people upgrade. At some point, you've got to stop holding on to things that don't work anymore." That got a stronger reaction. Laughter this time. Someone from the back added, "He probably fixes them with duct tape." More laughter. Elias stood there taking it, his face calm, almost distant. Then Hale straightened and clapped him on the shoulder. "Tell you what he said. Maybe one day you'll come around." Elias looked at the pump again, then at Hale, and finally he said quietly, maybe. It wasn't defiance. It wasn't agreement. But somehow it lingered in the air longer than anything else said that afternoon. The moment passed, but what happened next was the part nobody paid attention to at the time, and it would turn out to matter more than anything Hale had said on that stage. Because just 3 months later, the first repossession order came through. A small farm on the edge of the county had defaulted. The bank called in the debt. Hale Irrigation reclaimed their equipment, 3 pumps barely used, still under warranty. But Hale had a problem. Storage. His facility was full expansion delayed, and he needed somewhere to keep the repossessed units temporarily. That's when someone mentioned Elias Turner. He's got space, they said. Old shed out past Miller's Creek. Doesn't use it much. Hale laughed when he heard it. You mean the guy still running antiques? Same one. Hale thought about it for a moment. Then he smiled. Fine, he said. Let him store them. Won't hurt anything. The first delivery happened on a gray morning in October. A truck pulled up to Elias's property, unloading 3 heavy pumps onto the dirt beside the shed. Elias watched from a distance at first, then walked over slowly as the driver finished. Need these inside, the driver said, wiping sweat from his brow. Elias nodded and opened the shed. The machines were placed near the back, their metal still clean, their surfaces reflecting the dim light that slipped through the cracks in the wood. The driver handed Elias a paper. Temporary storage, he said. Company'll pick them up when they need 'em. Elias took the paper, glanced at it, then folded it carefully and slipped it into his coat pocket. He didn't ask questions. He didn't argue. He just closed the shed doors once the truck was gone. But as he stood there, hand resting on the rough wood, there was a look in his eyes that no one else saw. Not curiosity, not concern, something quieter than that. Recognition. Because there was something about those machines, something in the way they had been built, that reminded him of a time long before Hale ever stood on that stage. And before this story goes any further, there's something you need to understand about Elias Turner, because this was never really about storage. And it was never just about the pumps. It started decades earlier, in a smaller shed with a different man entirely. Elias's father, Thomas Turner, had been a mechanic when mechanics still listened more than they spoke. The kind of man who could stand beside a running engine, close his eyes, and tell you what was wrong before touching a single bolt. Their farm wasn't large, and it never tried to be. But it survived year after year because Thomas understood one thing better than most. Water wasn't just a resource. It was time, and machines that moved water. Those were the difference between a living field and a dead one. Elias grew up watching his father work on old pumps that other farmers had given up on. Machines dragged in from the edges of fields rusted, broken, written off as useless. Thomas never rushed. He would take them apart piece by piece, laying each component out carefully, studying wear patterns, listening to the story each machine was trying to tell. Most folks think a machine fails all at once, he once told Elias, handing him a worn-out valve. But it doesn't. It tells you it's struggling long before it stops. Elias listened. He always listened. And over time, he learned to hear it too. The subtle differences in vibration. The slight hesitation before a motor caught the uneven rhythm that meant something deep inside wasn't aligned the way it should be. By the time he was 20, he could rebuild a pump from memory. By 30, he could improve one without changing its core. And by the time his father passed, Elias had inherited more than just a piece of land. He had inherited a way of seeing things most people had forgotten how to notice. So when those first 3 pumps were placed in his shed in 2003, he didn't see storage. He saw something else, something no one else in that town was even looking for. And what he would discover in the months that followed would quietly begin to change everything. What most people didn't realize was that Elias didn't touch those pumps for nearly 2 weeks after they arrived. He left them exactly where the driver had placed them, sitting in the dim back corner of the shed, untouched, like he was letting them settle, or maybe listening from a distance before getting too close. Then one evening, just after sunset, he lit a single overhead bulb and walked in. He didn't bring tools at first, just a stool. He sat beside the nearest pump, resting his hand on the casing. Not moving. Not inspecting, just feeling it. The metal was still too new to have stories written into it. But there were hints. Always hints. He tapped it lightly with his knuckles, listened, turned the shaft slowly by hand, listened again. And that was the moment something didn't sit right. It was subtle. The kind of thing no manual would ever mention. A resistance that wasn't quite wrong, but wasn't right either. He didn't say anything. There was no one to say it to. But that night, Mwamba with tools. And that's when things began to change. At first, the deliveries came slowly. 1 farm here, 2 farms there. Each time Hale Irrigation repossessed equipment, they sent it out to Elias's shed just like before. Temporary storage. That's what every paper said. But months turned into a year, and no one came back for the machines. People in town noticed, of course. They always noticed anything that didn't make immediate sense. Still keeping Hale's junk out there? Someone asked Elias one morning at the diner. Elias just nodded. Another man laughed. You charging him rent? Or you just like collecting scrap? More laughter. Elias stirred his coffee and didn't answer. What they didn't see, what no one ever saw, was what happened after dark. Because night after night, long after the town went quiet, that old shed stayed lit. Elias worked slowly, always slowly. He took the first pump apart, piece by piece, laying every component out on a worn wooden table, just like his father used to. He studied the machining marks, the tolerances, the alignment of the internal veins, and the more he looked, the more something became clear. These weren't built the way they used to be. They were cleaner, lighter, more efficient on paper, but something had been taken out, something important. I need to stop here for a second, he would later say to no one in particular, standing alone in that shed. Because this part matters more than it seems. Most modern pumps, the ones Hale was selling, were designed for performance under ideal conditions. Perfect pressure, clean water, balanced loads, but fields were never ideal. Water carried sand grit fragments of soil. Pressure fluctuated. Bearings wore unevenly. And in those conditions, the smallest compromise became the biggest failure. Elias saw it in the design. A thinner housing here, a cheaper seal there. A tolerance just tight enough to save cost, but too tight to survive real work. But that wasn't the most important discovery, not even close, because buried inside the third pump he opened, he found something no one else would have recognized. The impeller wasn't standard. It had been machined differently, slightly heavier, slightly offset. Not defective, experimental. Elias sat back and stared at it for a long time, because he had seen something like that before, years ago. Long before Hale Irrigation became what it was. Back when Martin Hale wasn't a name people respected yet. Just a young engineer working under a different company. Back when they had tried things, tested limits, built machines that didn't always make sense on paper, but worked better in the field. Elias turned the piece in his hand. And that's when it clicked. This wasn't a mistake. It was a prototype. And it had been buried inside a machine that was never meant to last long enough for anyone to notice. But Elias noticed, and what he found next would change everything. Because once he knew what to look for, he started seeing patterns. Not all the pumps were the same. Some were standard models, cheap, efficient, predictable. But others had pieces that didn't belong. Stronger shafts, different bearing materials, reinforced housings hidden beneath standard casings. It was as if someone at some point had built a better machine, then hidden it inside a cheaper one. Elias didn't rush. He never rushed. He began separating the pumps, grouping them not by model, but by feel, by sound, by the way the metal responded under pressure. And slowly over months, then years, he started rebuilding them. Not restoring, rebuilding. He took the best parts from each, combining them in ways the original designers never intended. Adjusting clearances by fractions no one else would bother measuring. Reinforcing weak points, opening others. And every time he finished one, he tested it, not in perfect conditions, but in the worst ones he could create. Mud, debris, uneven loads, long run time. Most would have burned out. His didn't. They ran hotter, louder sometimes. But they didn't stop, and that was the difference. Out in the real world, not stopping mattered more than anything else. Years passed. The shed filled. 10 pumps became 20. 20 became 50. And still Hale Irrigation kept sending more. No one came to collect them. No one checked on them. To Hale, they were just numbers on a balance sheet. Losses already written off, but out on that quiet piece of land, something else was happening. Something no one had planned. Something no one was watching. Until the drought came. It started slowly, the way most disasters do. A few dry weeks in early summer. Then another month with barely any rain. By July, the soil had begun to crack, long, jagged lines stretching across fields that had once been soft and dark. Farmers turned to their pumps. They always did. And at first, everything seemed fine. The new systems, Hale's systems, kicked in, automatically adjusting pressure, optimizing flow, running exactly the way they were designed to. But conditions weren't ideal. They were never ideal. Sediment levels rose as water tables dropped. Pumps worked harder longer under stress they weren't built to handle. The first failure happened on a small farm just outside town. Then another, and another. At first, Hale's technicians blamed installation errors. Then maintenance. Then the farmers themselves. Improper use, they called it. But the failures kept spreading. And what happened next was the part nobody could ignore anymore. Because one evening, just before sunset, a farmer named Daniel Brooks drove out to Elias Turner's place with a pump in the back of his truck that had stopped working completely. He didn't come because he believed. He came because he had no other option. And as Elias stepped out of his shed, wiping his hands on a cloth, looking at that dead machine, there was something in his eyes that hadn't been there 15 years ago. Not frustration, not doubt. Something quieter than that. Something steady. Because this was the moment everything he had been doing in the dark was finally about to be seen. Daniel Brooks didn't say much when he climbed down from his truck. He didn't need to. The dust on his boots, the tightness in his jaw, the way he avoided looking directly at Elias, all of it said enough. "Stopped this morning," he muttered, nodding toward the pump in the back. "Wouldn't start again." Elias walked past him without a word and placed a hand on the machine. He didn't inspect it right away, didn't reach for tools. He just stood there for a few seconds, fingers resting lightly on the metal as if he were listening for something buried beneath the silence. Daniel shifted uncomfortably. Hale's people came out already, said the motor's fine, blamed the well. Elias nodded once. Then finally, he spoke. "It's not the well." That was it. No explanation. No sales pitch. Just that. Daniel frowned slightly. "Then what is it?" Elias stepped back, wiped his hand slowly on a cloth, and glanced toward the shed. "What happens next?" he said quietly, almost to himself, "is the part people usually remember." But he didn't explain further. He walked into the shed, and after a few seconds, he came back out, dragging something behind him. At first, Daniel didn't understand what he was looking at. It was a pump, yes, but not like the ones he was used to seeing. The casing was old or scratched, and repainted in places. The bolts didn't match perfectly. The housing had been reinforced with metal that looked reused. It didn't look reliable. It looked like something someone had built from leftovers. Daniel hesitated. "That thing gonna work?" Elias didn't answer. He just positioned it carefully beside the well, connecting hoses with slow, deliberate movements. Every action measured. No wasted motion. A couple of neighbors had started to gather by then, drawn by the sight of Daniel's truck sitting idle in the field. They watched from a distance, whispering. One of them laughed under his breath. "He's really gonna try that." Another shook his head. "That's not fixing it. That's replacing it with junk." Daniel heard them. He swallowed but said nothing. Because at that point, he didn't have the luxury of pride. Elias tightened the last connection, stepped back, and reached for the starter. There was a pause. A long one. The kind where even the wind seems to hold its breath. Then he pulled. The engine coughed once, twice, a rough, uneven sound like something waking up after a long sleep. Someone in the crowd chuckled. "Told you," but then it changed. The rhythm steadied. The vibration deepened. And suddenly the pump roared to life, not loudly, not violently, but with a kind of steady, grounded force that didn't waver. A second later, water surged up from the well. Clear, strong, relentless. It hit the dry soil with a sound that cut through everything else. For a moment, no one spoke. Not Daniel, not the men watching, not even Elias, because what they were seeing didn't match what they believed. Daniel took a step closer, staring at the flow. That's full pressure." Elias nodded slightly. "It won't drop." "How do you know?" Elias glanced at the machine. "Because it hasn't in years." That didn't make sense. Not yet. But it didn't need to. Because within days, word spread. First one farm, then another, then 5. People who had never once considered going to Elias Turner started showing up at his property with broken machines, desperate questions, and less pride than they arrived with. At first, he didn't offer much. He would look, listen, sometimes fix what they had. Other times, he would bring out one of his own. And every time those old rebuilt pumps ran, they didn't stop. Not after a day. Not after a week. And that's when things began to shift. Because it wasn't just about Daniel Brooks anymore. It was about dozens of farms. Fields that should have failed. Holding on. Crops that should have dried. Surviving. And the one thing all those places had in common was a machine that had once been written off. Martin Hale heard about it soon enough. At first he dismissed it. Temporary luck, he told his team. Old equipment always looks good, right before it fails. But the reports didn't stop. And worse, the failures of his own systems kept increasing. Complaints piled up. Repair requests doubled. Then tripled. His technicians couldn't keep up. And for the first time in years, Hale irrigation wasn't the solution. It was the problem. So Hale did what men like him always do when something doesn't make sense. He went to see it himself. It was late August when he pulled into Elias Turner's property, a black truck. Clean. Out of place against the dust and worn wood. By then, there were already 3 other vehicles parked outside the shed. Farmers waiting. Some pacing. Some watching the fields in the distance where water was flowing again. Hale stepped out, adjusting his cuffs, his expression tight. He didn't greet anyone. He walked straight toward the shed and stopped because what he saw inside was not what he expected. Rows of pumps, dozens of them, organized, maintained, some partially disassembled, others fully intact. But all of them different. Hale stepped closer to one, running his hand along the casing. "This is one of mine," he said. Elias, standing a few feet away, nodded. It was. Hale turned sharply. "What does that mean?" Elias didn't answer immediately. He walked over to the pump, placed his hand on it the same way he always did, and said quietly, "You stopped building them like this." Hale frowned. "No, I didn't." Elias shook his head slightly. "Not on purpose. That was enough to spark anger." "Don't talk like you understand my machines," Hale snapped. "You store them. That's all you do." A few of the farmers nearby fell silent, because they had heard that tone before, that same confidence, that same dismissal. Elias looked at him calm as ever. Then he did something no one expected. He reached down and removed a panel from the pump. Inside, the components didn't match the original design. Not exactly. Hale stared at it, confusion flickering for the first time. "What is this?" he asked. Elias wiped his hands slowly. "This," he said, "is what your machine was trying to be before you made it cheaper." The words landed heavier than anything shouted. Hale's expression hardened. "That's not how engineering works." Elias met his gaze. "No," he said. "That's how business works." Silence. And in that silence, something shifted. Because for the first time, Martin Hale wasn't looking at a man beneath him. He was looking at something he didn't fully understand. And what happened next was the part nobody in that county would ever forget. It wasn't planned. It wasn't announced. But it spread anyway. A large farm on the south end of the county, over 300 acres, lost its entire irrigation system. In a single afternoon, every pump, every line, gone. The owner, desperate, called Hale first. Of course he did. But Hale couldn't fix it. Not in time. So someone no one remembers who said the name no one used to take seriously. Call Elias. By the time Elias arrived, half the town was already there. Watching. Waiting. Judging. Hale stood near the main well, arms crossed, his jaw tight. "You're wasting time," he said as Elias approached. "This system needs proper equipment." Elias didn't respond. He walked past him, slowly, deliberately, and from the back of his truck, he unloaded a single pump. Old, rebuilt, unimpressive at first glance. A few people laughed, quietly, because they had seen this before, or at least, they thought they had. Elias connected it himself, every bolt tightened by hand, every hose checked twice. The sun was beginning to dip low by the time he finished. The field stretched out behind them, dry, brittle, waiting. Elias stood up, looked at the machine, then at the well, and for just a second, everything went still. He pulled the starter. The engine turned, hesitated. Then what? A low, steady rumble spread through the ground. Not aggressive, not loud, but certain. And then water. Not a trickle. Not a burst. A constant, powerful surge that didn't falter. It ran through the lines, into the field, across the soil. People stepped closer, then closer still. Because what they were seeing wasn't luck. It wasn't coincidence. It was something else. Something built, not bought. Hale didn't move, didn't speak. He just stared at the machine, at the flow, at the impossible steadiness of it all. And then Elias turned to him, not with anger, not with pride, just quiet certainty. "You had it," he said. Once. That was the moment, the one no one forgot. Because in front of everyone, the man who had everything realized he had missed the one thing that mattered most. And when the season ended, when the fields turned green again in places they should have died, and when Hale irrigation finally collapsed under the weight of its own failures, people went back to that shed. The same one they had laughed at. The same one they had ignored. Only now, the doors meant something different. Because inside wasn't storage. It was ownership. Legal papers were drawn. Assets were counted. And one by one, those pumps, every single one left behind, forgotten, written off, were listed under a single name. Elias Turner. But here's the part that mattered more than any of that. He didn't sell them, didn't hoard them, didn't turn them into power. He lent them, repaired them, taught others how to listen, the way his father had taught him. And over time, The man they once called a junk collector became something else entirely. Not famous, not rich in the way people measure, but necessary. And if you stood out there years later watching water move steadily across fields that once failed, you might remember something simple, something easy to overlook, that the things people laugh at are often the things they don't understand, and that old machines, like old men, don't stop being valuable just because the world stops paying attention. Because sometimes they're just waiting long enough for the world to come back and ask for help.